On a humid afternoon in July 1987, a sanitation worker named Darnell Hayes spotted a cream-colored Kenmore refrigerator sitting on the curb outside a pawn shop on Chicago's South Side. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, "Works great, $50. Darnell had been living without a working fridge for 3 weeks, keeping his groceries in a cooler filled with ice from the gas station. His wife Angela was 8 months pregnant with their second child, and the summer heat was making everything harder. $50 was more than he wanted to spend, but it was less than half what the appliance stores were charging. He went inside and bought it without asking questions. 10 days later, while Angela was cleaning out the freezer compartment to make room for frozen vegetables, she noticed the ice maker felt loose. She called Darnell over, and together they pulled the mechanism forward. Behind it, stuffed into a hollowed-out cavity in the freezer wall, were plastic bags filled with cash. Darnell's hands shook as he pulled them out, one after another, stacking them on the kitchen table. When they finished counting, they were staring at $130,000. What Darnell and Angela didn't know was that the money represented a portion of the $475,000 stolen from a Brinks armored truck outside First Midwest Bank in Oak Lawn, Illinois, on March 12, 1987. The man who sold them the refrigerator, a 34-year-old former Brinks driver named Jerome Blackwell, had hidden the cash there days after the robbery and sold the appliance to distance himself from the evidence. By the time Darnell found the money, Jerome had already disappeared into Chicago's homeless population, sleeping in shelters and under viaducts, waiting for the investigation to go cold so he could reclaim what he'd hidden. But Jerome never got the chance. The discovery of the cash in Darnell Hayes' kitchen would set off a chain of events that destroyed an innocent man's life and exposed one of the most audacious armored car heists in Illinois history. Darnell would spend 6 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Jerome would spend 11 years living on the streets before dying of pneumonia in a county shelter, his secret buried with him. And the truth would only emerge through a chance connection that proved once and for all that the justice system had convicted the wrong man. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Darnell Hayes grew up in the Bronzeville neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, the youngest of 4 children raised by a single mother who worked as a cook at a public school cafeteria. He graduated from DuSable High School in 1979 and went straight to work for the Chicago Department of Streets and Sanitation. The job was stable, union protected, and paid enough to eventually move out of his mother's house. In 1984, he married Angela Morrison, a cashier at a Jewel Osco grocery store. They rented a small 2-bedroom apartment on South Prairie Avenue, scraping by on their combined income of about $32,000 a year. By the summer of 1987, Darnell was 26 years old, with a 3-year-old daughter named Shanice and another baby on the way. Money was always tight. His sanitation route started at 5 in the morning and ended around 2 in the afternoon, giving him time to pick up occasional cash jobs doing yard work or helping people move. Angela worked part-time, reducing her hours as her pregnancy progressed. They were the kind of working poor that Chicago had in abundance. People who followed all the rules and still struggled to stay ahead of rent and utility bills. When their refrigerator stopped working in early July, it felt like the last straw. The compressor had died, and the repair estimate was more than the unit was worth. Darnell spent 2 weeks looking for a cheap replacement, checking garage sales and classified ads. He needed something that worked and that he could afford immediately. The $50 Kenmore outside Bobby's Pawn and Trade on South Cottage Grove Avenue seemed like an answer to prayer. The pawn shop owner, a heavy-set white man named Bobby Krasinski, had acquired the refrigerator 3 days earlier from a customer looking to sell quickly. Bobby told Darnell the unit worked fine, just needed a good cleaning. Darnell paid cash, borrowed his brother-in-law's pickup truck, and hauled the refrigerator home that same afternoon. Angela was relieved. They plugged it in, confirmed it was cooling properly, and started transferring their food from the ice-filled cooler. The ice maker didn't work, but they didn't care. They hadn't had an ice maker in their old fridge either. For 10 days, life continued normally. Darnell went to work, came home tired and smelling of garbage, played with Shanice, and helped Angela prepare for the baby. The refrigerator hummed quietly in their kitchen, keeping their food cold, drawing no special attention. Then, Angela decided to clean it thoroughly before the baby arrived. She was scrubbing the freezer compartment when she noticed the ice maker assembly rattling loosely. She tugged on it, and the entire mechanism shifted forward. Behind it, she could see something that didn't look like wiring or insulation. She called for Darnell, her voice tight with confusion. He came into the kitchen still wearing his work boots, and together they carefully pulled the ice maker completely free from its housing. The plastic bags were vacuum sealed, the cash inside compressed and tightly packed. They pulled out one bag, then another, then 3 more. They sat at their small kitchen table and unwrapped the bundles, staring at more money than they'd ever seen in their lives. The bills were mostly 20s and 50s, bound with paper bank straps that had numbers printed on them. Darnell's first instinct was fear. This wasn't right. Nobody hid money like this unless something was wrong. Angela wanted to call the police immediately. Darnell hesitated. He thought about their situation, about the baby coming, about the constant struggle to pay bills. He wondered if maybe they could keep some of it, just enough to get ahead. But Angela was firm. This money didn't belong to them, and keeping it was stealing. After 2 hours of anxious discussion, Darnell agreed. They would do the right thing. At 7:30 that evening, Darnell called the Chicago Police Department's 3rd District Station and reported finding a large amount of cash in a refrigerator he'd purchased. The dispatcher seemed skeptical at first, but Darnell insisted. Within 40 minutes, 2 patrol officers arrived at their apartment. When they saw the money spread across the kitchen table, they immediately called for detectives. Detective Raymond Kowalski and his partner, Detective Lisa Chen, arrived just after 9. They were with the Chicago Police Department's Major Crimes Unit, and they'd seen enough to know that $130,000 hidden in a refrigerator wasn't normal. They took Darnell's statement carefully. Where did you buy the refrigerator? When? How much did you pay? Did you know the money was there? Darnell answered everything honestly, showing them the receipt from Bobby's pawn and trade, explaining how they'd only discovered the cash while cleaning. The detectives bagged the money as evidence and took down all of Darnell's information. They told him they'd need to investigate where the cash came from, but they thanked him for reporting it. Darnell felt relieved as they left. He'd done the right thing. He had nothing to hide. The investigation into the money's origin moved quickly. The serial numbers on the bank straps matched records from the Brinks armored car robbery 5 months earlier. The FBI had been tracking those numbers since March, waiting for any of the stolen bills to surface. When Chicago PD ran the numbers through the federal database, alarms went off at the FBI's Chicago field office. Special Agent Thomas Bradford, who'd been the lead investigator on the Brinks case, received the notification within hours. Bradford reviewed the case file and the new information. A sanitation worker claims he found the money in a used refrigerator. Bradford had been investigating financial crimes for 15 years, and his experience told him that people who found stolen money were usually the people who stole it in the first place. The story was too convenient, too clean. The next morning, FBI agents and Chicago detectives returned to Darnell's apartment. This time, the questions were different. How did you really get the money? Who are you working with? Where's the rest of it? Darnell repeated his story, confused by the sudden hostility. He'd reported finding the cash. He'd cooperated completely. Why were they treating him like a criminal? The agents searched his apartment, tearing through closets and drawers, looking for more hidden money or evidence connecting him to the robbery. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. They interviewed Angela, who was crying and frightened, worried the stress would harm the baby. They questioned Darnell's neighbors, his co-workers, his family members. They pulled his financial records, his phone records, his employment history. They built a timeline of his movements on March 12th, the day of the robbery. What they found should have cleared him immediately. Darnell had been at work that day, verified by time cards and his supervisor. His garbage truck had GPS tracking that showed his exact route throughout the morning and afternoon. He'd been nowhere near Oak Lawn when the Brinks truck was hit. But Agent Bradford had a theory that fit the evidence differently. Maybe Darnell wasn't the robber. Maybe he was working with the robber. Maybe he was the designated holder of the money, and the refrigerator story was cover for when they eventually got caught. The FBI traced the refrigerator backward. Bobby Krasinski at the pawn shop confirmed he'd sold it to Darnell, but he couldn't remember much about the man who'd sold it to him. A thin black guy, maybe 30 or 40, needed money quickly. Paid the $50 price Bobby offered without negotiating. No ID required for selling used goods. Bobby had so many transactions daily that faces blurred together. He thought he might have security camera footage, but when agents reviewed the tapes, the quality was terrible. Just grainy black and white images that showed a figure in a baseball cap and jacket. Face mostly hidden. The FBI showed Bobby a photo lineup that included Jerome Blackwell's employee picture from Brinks. Bobby squinted at the photos and tentatively identified Jerome, but he wasn't certain. The man in his shop had a beard and longer hair, looked rougher than the clean-cut image in the photo. Bobby's uncertain identification was enough for the FBI to know they were on the right track about the robbery. But it didn't clear Darnell. Instead, it seemed to confirm Bradford's theory. Jerome Blackwell had stolen the money and hidden it in the refrigerator. Then someone, possibly Darnell Hayes, had acquired the refrigerator as part of a prearranged plan. When the pressure got too intense, they'd tried the "we just found it" story. The federal prosecutor saw holes in the theory, but the pressure to close the case was intense. The Brinks company wanted results. The media had covered the robbery extensively. An unsolved armored car heist made law enforcement look incompetent. And here was a suspect, literally caught with the stolen money in his possession, no matter how innocent his story sounded. In November 1987, 4 months after finding the money, Darnell Hayes was arrested and charged as an accessory after the fact in the Brinks armored car robbery. The indictment alleged that he had knowingly received and concealed stolen property, specifically $130,000 taken during the March 12th heist. The fact that he'd reported finding the money was dismissed as a calculated move to establish plausible deniability. Darnell couldn't afford a private attorney. He was assigned a public defender named Michelle Torres, a young lawyer fresh out of Northwestern Law School who was already handling 40 other cases. Torres believed Darnell was innocent, but believing and proving were different things. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. He had the money was stolen. His story about finding it seemed implausible to investigators who'd seen every variation of criminal excuse. The trial took place in April 1988 at the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They presented the evidence of the robbery, the trail of serial numbers, and the discovery of the cash in Darnell's refrigerator. They argued that no innocent person ends up with $130,000 in stolen money by accident. They suggested that Darnell's working-class background and financial struggles provided motive to participate in the theft, either directly or as an accomplice. Torres fought back with everything she had. She presented Darnell's work records proving he was on his sanitation route when the robbery occurred. She brought in character witnesses who testified that Darnell was honest and hard-working. She emphasized that he'd immediately called police upon finding the money. She argued that the evidence showed Darnell was a victim of circumstance, not a criminal conspirator. But the prosecution had Agent Bradford, who testified with authority and conviction. Bradford explained his theory of the case, painting Darnell as the money holder in a larger conspiracy. He acknowledged they hadn't found Jerome Blackwell, the actual robber, but suggested that Blackwell and Hayes were connected in ways the investigation hadn't yet uncovered. The fact that they couldn't prove the connection didn't mean it didn't exist. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They were divided, uncertain, troubled by the lack of direct evidence, but swayed by the sheer improbability of Darnell's story. On April 19, 1988, they returned a guilty verdict on the charge of receiving stolen property. The judge sentenced Darnell to 8 years in federal prison. Angela Hayes gave birth to their son, Marcus, 3 days before Darnell was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana. She brought the baby to the courthouse in a carrier, and Darnell held his newborn son for 20 minutes in a holding cell before being transported away. He sobbed the entire bus ride to prison, not for himself, but for his family, for the childhood his children would lose, for the injustice of being punished for doing the right thing. Prison was brutal for Darnell in ways that had nothing to do with violence or physical danger. The psychological weight of wrongful conviction crushed him slowly. He maintained his innocence to anyone who would listen. But nobody in prison believes they're guilty. And after a while, people stopped listening. Angela visited twice a month, bringing Shanice and baby Marcus on the long drive from Chicago to Indiana. Darnell watched his children grow through glass partitions and monitored phone calls, missing every milestone, every birthday, every moment that mattered. Torres continued working on his appeal, but the legal system moved with glacial slowness. The appellate court upheld his conviction in 1990, finding that the evidence, while circumstantial, was sufficient to support the jury's verdict. Torres tried petitioning for clemency, arguing that Darnell had cooperated fully and that his sentence was unjust. The petitions went nowhere. Meanwhile, Jerome Blackwell was living less than 10 miles from where Darnell sat in prison. Not literally, of course. Jerome was on the streets of Chicago while Darnell was in Indiana. But the irony was sharp. The man actually responsible for the robbery was free, sleeping under bridges and in shelters, while an innocent sanitation worker served time for his crime. Jerome had watched the news coverage of Darnell's arrest and trial with growing horror. He'd sold the refrigerator to distance himself from the evidence, never imagining that someone else would be convicted for his crime. Part of him wanted to come forward, to confess, to free the innocent man, but self-preservation was stronger than conscience. Coming forward meant life in prison. Jerome told himself that Hayes would eventually be exonerated through appeal, that the truth would come out somehow. He used that rationalization to live with the guilt. The years ground forward. Darnell marked time by his children's ages. Shanice was 6, then 8, then 10. Marcus learned to walk, to talk, to read, all without his father present. Angela worked 2 jobs to keep the apartment and feed the kids. She never remarried, never even dated, holding on to faith that somehow, eventually, justice would prevail. In prison, Darnell became friendly with another inmate named Terrell Washington, who'd been convicted of wire fraud and had connections to various investigative journalists on the outside. Terrell listened to Darnell's story over months of conversations in the prison yard. Unlike everyone else, Terrell believed him. There was something in the details, in the consistency of Darnell's account, that rang true. In 1992, Terrell reached out to a reporter named Sarah Martinez who worked for the Chicago Tribune and was known for investigating wrongful convictions. Martinez took on the case reluctantly at first. She'd heard plenty of prisoners claim innocence, but when she reviewed the trial transcripts and evidence, she found the same inconsistencies that had troubled Darnell's jury. There was no physical evidence connecting Darnell to the robbery, no witnesses, no forensics, just the money and a theory about conspiracy that had never been proven. Martinez began investigating in earnest. She interviewed Bobby Krasinski again, now 5 years after the original incident. Bobby admitted that his identification of Jerome Blackwell from the photo lineup had been uncertain, that FBI agents had pressured him to choose someone. She tracked down members of Darnell's garbage crew who confirmed his presence on the route the day of the robbery. She found inconsistencies in Agent Bradford's investigation notes, suggestions that he'd focused on Darnell to the exclusion of other possibilities. Most importantly, Martinez started investigating Jerome Blackwell's disappearance. She found that Jerome had family in Chicago who hadn't heard from him since shortly after the robbery. She discovered that Jerome's car had been found abandoned near his apartment in March 1987, the same week as the heist. She learned from former Brinks employees that Jerome had been under financial stress, supporting sick parents, drowning in debt. The profile of Jerome as the actual thief was clear and compelling. But where was Jerome? Martinez spent months trying to track him down, hitting dead ends at every turn. No credit card usage, no bank activity, no arrests under his name. It was as if he'd vanished completely. She began checking homeless shelters, knowing that some criminals went to ground in the anonymous world of the streets. She showed Jerome's old photo to social workers and shelter staff across Chicago. Nobody recognized him, or if they did, they weren't saying. The break came in February 1994, purely by chance. Martinez was interviewing residents at Pacific Garden Mission for a different story about homelessness and winter mortality. She showed Jerome's photo to a shelter worker named Patricia Chen, who studied it carefully. Patricia thought the face looked familiar, but the man she knew was much rougher, with long, grey-streaked hair and a thick beard. She thought his name might be Jerry or Jerome. He'd been staying at the shelter off and on for years. He'd been sick recently, in and out, suffering from a persistent cough and fever. Martinez felt her pulse quicken. She asked Patricia if Jerome was there now. Patricia checked the sign-in log. Yes, he'd checked in the night before, had been assigned a bed in dormitory C. Martinez waited in the shelter's main room while Patricia went to find him. 20 minutes passed. Then Patricia returned, her face pale. Jerome had been found unresponsive in his bed. An ambulance was on the way. Jerome Blackwell died at Cook County Hospital at 4:17 that afternoon. The cause of death was pneumonia complicated by malnutrition and untreated diabetes. He was 41 years old. He died without identification, without family present, another anonymous casualty of life on the streets. His body was taken to the county morgue, where it would have been buried in a potter's field grave if Martinez hadn't been there to identify him. The medical examiner took Jerome's fingerprints as part of the standard procedure. When Martinez insisted those prints be run through criminal databases, they came back with an immediate hit. Jerome Blackwell wanted in connection with the 1987 Brinks armored car robbery. The FBI was notified. Agent Bradford, now a supervisor, was shocked. They'd assumed Jerome was either dead or living under a false identity somewhere far from Chicago. Nobody had imagined he'd been hiding in plain sight on the streets of the same city where he'd committed the crime. Martinez immediately published her findings. Her article in the Chicago Tribune detailed the entire story, from the robbery to Darnell's wrongful conviction to Jerome's death. The piece created a firestorm. Civil rights organizations demanded Darnell's immediate release. Legal scholars wrote about the dangers of circumstantial evidence and prosecutorial tunnel vision. The FBI faced harsh criticism for their investigation and for Agent Bradford's theory that had put an innocent man in prison. The federal prosecutor's office moved quickly to correct the injustice. In March 1994, they filed a motion to vacate Darnell Hayes' conviction based on new evidence proving that Jerome Blackwell, not Darnell, had been responsible for receiving and concealing the stolen money. The motion was granted within days. On March 23, 1994, after serving nearly 6 years in federal prison, Darnell Hayes walked free. His release was bittersweet. He'd lost 6 years with his children, 6 years of his life, 6 years of freedom for a crime he didn't commit. Shanice was now 13, Marcus was 6, and both barely knew their father. Angela had waited, but the marriage was strained by years of separation and trauma. Darnell struggled to find work with a federal conviction on his record, even though it had been vacated. Employers saw the arrest and imprisonment and didn't bother reading the part about exoneration. The FBI's investigation into Jerome's hidden life continued after his death. They never found the remaining $345,000. Jerome had taken the locations of his hiding spots to his grave, and without his guidance, the money could have been anywhere in Chicago's vast urban landscape, buried under railroad tracks, hidden in demolished buildings, stashed in storm drains, lost forever to time and the city's constant transformation. The Cook County medical examiner released Jerome's body to his family, his elderly mother and 2 surviving siblings. They held a small funeral at a Baptist church in Englewood. About 20 people attended. Jerome's mother, now 73 and in a wheelchair, wept for the son she'd lost twice, once to his disappearance and again to his death. She told reporters that she'd always wondered what happened to Jerome, whether he was alive or dead, guilty or innocent. Now she had answers, but they brought no comfort. Darnell Hayes filed a wrongful conviction lawsuit against the federal government in 1995. The case took 3 years to resolve, finally settling in 1998 for $1,200,000. The money was supposed to compensate for 6 years of imprisonment, for lost wages, for the destruction of his family life, for psychological trauma. Darnell used most of it to pay legal fees and to buy a small house on Chicago's far south side. He started a lawn care business, working alone, preferring solitude to the questions and pitiful looks he received when people learned his story. Angela and Darnell tried to rebuild their marriage, but the damage was too deep. They divorced quietly in 2000, remaining friendly for the sake of Shanice and Marcus. Darnell never remarried. He became deeply involved with organizations fighting wrongful convictions, speaking at conferences, and supporting other exonerees. He testified before Congress about the dangers of circumstantial evidence and prosecutorial overreach. His story became a case study in law schools across the country, an example of how the system could fail catastrophically. Agent Bradford retired from the FBI in 2001. He never publicly apologized to Darnell Hayes, though he later admitted in an interview with a criminal justice podcast that the case haunted him. He'd been so certain of his theory, so convinced that nobody legitimately finds stolen money by accident. His experience had taught him that criminals lie, that convenient stories are usually covers, but sometimes, rarely, the convenient story is simply the truth. Bobby Krasinski sold his pawn shop in 1999 and moved to Florida. He gave several interviews over the years about the refrigerator and the role his shop played in the case. He always expressed regret that he couldn't remember more about Jerome's appearance when he sold the appliance, couldn't provide better identification that might have prevented Darnell's conviction. The security camera footage from that day was lost years ago, destroyed in accordance with the shop's policy of recycling tapes every 6 months. The Brinks Company recovered the $130,000 found in the refrigerator, but they wrote off the remaining $345,000 as a permanent loss. They implemented new security protocols for armored car drivers, including more frequent rotations of partners and routes, better GPS tracking, and additional oversight during high-value transfers. Jerome Blackwell's theft, while devastating for Darnell Hayes, had at least produced reforms that made similar crimes more difficult. Sarah Martinez, the Tribune reporter who cracked the case, won multiple journalism awards for her investigation. She continued covering criminal justice issues throughout her career, maintaining a friendship with Darnell and advocating for reforms to prevent wrongful convictions. She often cited his case when arguing for stronger protections for defendants and for more rigorous standards in circumstantial evidence. Cases. Shanice Hayes graduated from the University of Illinois in 2004 and became a social worker, dedicating her career to helping families affected by incarceration. She spoke openly about growing up with a father in prison, about the stigma and hardship, about the joy and difficulty of his eventual return. Marcus Hayes joined the military after high school, served 2 tours in Iraq, and later became a paralegal specializing in criminal appeals. Both children transformed their family's trauma into purpose, using their pain to help others navigate similar circumstances. Darnell Hayes died in 2019 at the age of 58 from a heart attack. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including dozens of exonerees whose cases he'd supported over the years. Speakers remembered him not for his victimhood, but for his resilience, his refusal to become bitter, his determination to create meaning from injustice. His story was retold in obituaries and remembrances, a reminder of the system's capacity for both grave error and eventual correction. The Kenmore refrigerator that started everything was never located. Somewhere in Chicago, possibly still running in someone's kitchen, or maybe long since discarded to a landfill, That appliance represented the random chance that destroyed one life and ended another. If Jerome had chosen a different hiding place, if Darnell had bought a different refrigerator, if any of 1,000 small decisions had gone differently, both men might have lived entirely different lives. The case remains a landmark in discussions of wrongful conviction. Legal scholars cite it when arguing about the burden of proof, about the dangers of conviction based solely on possession of stolen property, about the need for concrete evidence connecting defendants to crimes. The Jerome Blackwell Darnell Hayes case demonstrates how circumstantial evidence can create convincing narratives that are completely wrong, how assumptions about guilt can override facts that point toward innocence. Jerome's remaining $345,000 has never been found. In the decades since his death, Chicago has transformed through waves of gentrification, demolition, and reconstruction. The railroad trestles where he might have buried money have been reinforced or replaced. The vacant lots where he stashed cash have become shopping centers and residential developments. The burned-out buildings he used as hiding spots have been torn down and rebuilt. Whatever money remains is likely buried under concrete and steel, entombed forever in the city's infrastructure. Occasionally, construction workers or demolition crews uncover unexpected caches of cash in old buildings or underground spaces around Chicago. Each discovery prompts speculation about whether it might be part of Jerome's hidden fortune. But without serial numbers or other identifying markers, there's no way to confirm the connection. The money has become urban legend, part of Chicago's mythology of hidden wealth and lost treasures. The story of the refrigerator fortune ultimately became a story about the fragility of justice and the permanence of consequences. Jerome Blackwell made one desperate choice and spent the rest of his life paying for it, dying alone and anonymous on the streets. Darnell Hayes did everything right, reported found money to authorities, cooperated fully with investigators, and still spent 6 years in prison for someone else's crime. Neither man got what he deserved. Neither man found the justice or peace he sought. The case changed how the FBI investigates property crimes, leading to new protocols about verifying connections between suspects and stolen goods. It influenced training for federal prosecutors about the risks of building cases on circumstantial evidence alone. It became required reading for public defenders, learning to recognize and challenge weak prosecutions. The ripples from that $50 refrigerator transaction spread through the entire criminal justice system, forcing reforms that protected future defendants from similar fates. In the end, the refrigerator fortune was more curse than blessing for everyone it touched. Jerome died impoverished and alone despite stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Darnell lost years of his life despite being completely innocent. The money that was supposed to solve Jerome's problems destroyed him instead. The discovery that should have been Darnell's salvation became his damnation. Sometimes the right thing to do leads to the wrong outcome. Sometimes the system meant to protect the innocent becomes the instrument of their punishment. And sometimes a $50 refrigerator purchased on a summer afternoon becomes the axis around which entire lives rotate and collapse. The legal precedent established by Darnell Hayes' wrongful conviction continued to influence courtroom proceedings for decades after his exoneration. In 2007, the Illinois Supreme Court cited his case in a landmark ruling that required prosecutors to provide more substantial evidence when charging defendants with possession of stolen property. The court ruled that mere possession alone, without additional evidence linking the defendant to the underlying theft or knowledge of the property's stolen status, was insufficient for conviction. Defense attorneys across the state began invoking the Hayes precedent, successfully arguing for dismissal of charges in cases where prosecutors relied primarily on circumstantial possession. The psychological toll on Darnell's family extended far beyond his release from prison. Angela Hayes underwent therapy for years, processing the trauma of watching her husband arrested, convicted, and imprisoned, while she struggled alone to raise their children. She developed severe anxiety and trust issues with law enforcement that never fully resolved. Even routine traffic stops would trigger panic attacks. She eventually became an advocate for families of the wrongfully convicted, leading support groups and speaking at conferences about the collateral damage that wrongful imprisonment inflicts on innocent family members who are never compensated or acknowledged as victims. Marcus Hayes wrote extensively about his experience growing up with an imprisoned father in a memoir published in 2015 titled The Refrigerator's Son. The book detailed his childhood confusion about why his father was gone, the shame he felt when classmates learned his father was in prison, and the complicated emotions when Darnell was finally exonerated. Marcus described the strange cognitive dissonance of simultaneously celebrating his father's release while mourning the 6 years they'd lost together. The memoir became required reading in several criminal justice reform programs and sparked national conversations about the Children of the Wrongfully Convicted, the Pacific Garden mission where Jerome spent his final years installed. A small memorial plaque in 2005, not to honor Jerome specifically, but to commemorate all the forgotten individuals who died in their care over the decades. The plaque listed no names, just a simple inscription that read, "In memory of those who sought shelter here and found their final rest. May their stories remind us that every person matters, every life has value, and every soul deserves dignity." Shelter workers often pointed out the plaque to volunteers and donors, using Jerome's story as an example of how homelessness could swallow anyone, how easily a person could disappear into the invisible margins of urban America. The building that once housed Bobby's pawn and trade was demolished in 2012 to make way for a luxury condominium development. Before demolition crews tore it down, a local historian photographed the storefront and archived images of the interior, preserving the space where the fateful refrigerator transaction had occurred 25 years earlier. Those photographs now reside in the Chicago History Museum's collection, documenting the city's South Side commercial districts. Occasionally, museum curators include them in exhibits about Chicago crime history, the images serving as visual anchors for telling the story of how a $50 appliance sale changed multiple lives forever.